Welcome everyone to AusHeritage's public webinar, Hope in the Dark, the potential of heritage conservation, management and presentation today. My name is Alex Marsden and I'm Director on the board of AusHeritage, along with my co-chair Sharon Veale, and I will begin with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands we are all on today, including the lands where all our speakers are and audience are, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm speaking from beautiful Ngunnawal country, also known as Canberra, where sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We have a jam-packed hour ahead of us. I'll quickly run through the program structure, kick off the proceedings with a few words on the theme of hope, optimism and impact, and then hand over to Sharon to speak about the role of AusHeritage and introduce the speakers. There are 4 speakers, 2 international and 2 Australian. Each will give a 5-minute presentation, and after the last one, we will have 30 minutes for discussion and questions. Please put your questions as they occur to you in the chat box, and I'll pick them up from there. We'll end at 4 p.m. with hearty thanks to our 4 panelists and a reminder to the AusHeritage members online that our members forum will be about to commence on a new Zoom link. Okay. Well, the theme for today's webinar is about hope and the power of cultural heritage, history, ideas, community and authentic places to provide us with meaning, solace and inspiration. We've had a tough couple of years and there are challenges ahead, but in that overused but absolutely correct cliche, there are so many opportunities for our sector to support and nourish people and their imaginations, education and connections with their communities, this region and the world. On that optimistic note, I'll now hand over to my co-chair Sharon Veale to move us forward.
Thank you so much, Alex. Welcome, everyone. I'm on Gadigal country. AusHeritage is thrilled today to be able to present this panel of international and local speakers. AusHeritage, for those of you who don't already know, is a network of Australian cultural heritage management organisations established by the Australian government in 1996. And they contribute to building and sustaining cultural heritage industries, not only within Australia, but elsewhere. Over the 25 years of AusHeritage's work, it's focused on the promotion of Australian heritage and conservation services and worked enthusiastically to build relationships in the international exchange of knowledge and experience in heritage. AusHeritage members come from a variety of disciplines, including materials conservation, conservation architects and planners, academics, urban planners, historians, environmental lawyers, cultural tourism planners, and heritage managers. I think with this diversity comes a multiplicity of perspectives, and this generates nuance, sophistication, as well as deeper and richer understandings. To that end, I'm delighted to welcome our 4 panelists today: Devay Gupta, Mathew Trinker, Rahman, and Heather Brown. Our first speaker is Devay Gupta. Divay is a leading heritage conservation architect in India, where he's been striving for over 20 years to better help manage and conserve cultural heritage resources. He currently heads the architectural division of Intact, based in New Delhi. He's an alumni of ICOM and the University of Birmingham School of Planning and Architecture, and has contributed to prestigious projects across the world, including in the UK, USA, India, Afghanistan, Nepal, and Cambodia. He's participated in joint UNESCO and ICOM expert missions to World Heritage Sites and is a member of the National Cultural Fund and Advisory Committee to the government in India on World Heritage Matters. He's also a visiting faculty member and on the Board of Studies at the Department of Architecture and Conservation at SPA in New Delhi. Divay's topic today is Enduring Heritage, Moving Towards Sustainability. Over to you, Divay.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Alex, for this introduction. It's my pleasure to speak here. And since I have a very precious 5 minutes, I'll immediately start with my presentation. From being a buzzword, sustainability has become an essential component of our lives. This is especially relevant due to the climate crisis that we face today. Though the importance and impact of sustainability in the environmental world is well appreciated, this is sadly not the case with cultural heritage, even when culture is considered as the fourth pillar of sustainable development. However, I would argue and would be much happier to see culture becoming the beam, so as to continue that architectural simile, holding or connecting the other pillars of economic growth, social inclusions, and environmental protection. I feel that culture is one aspect that can be cross-cutting integrator for all the SDGs combined, be it poverty elimination, education, social inclusion, health, resilience, or even partnerships, considering the multi and interdisciplinary approach inherent in the heritage conservation field. While there is specific mention of culture and natural heritage under the Sustainable Development Goal 11, culture heritage, I feel, can be a driving force which can enable us to achieve all our sustainable development goals. I'm not saying this merely because I belong to this sector, but based on my experience where I have realized over the last 25 years, that every action one takes towards heritage conservation, however big or mundane, meets with some sustainable goal or the other. Post-pandemic, there's been more and more interest in local, and if this trend continues, it can give the much needed push to heritage, provided we are able to put heritage at center stage. Now, this we can do by creating local solutions even to some of our global problems or challenges. This again needs heritage to be integrated within the development framework and not treated as an extra optional cherry on the cake, but the cake itself. For this, I think we may need to really rethink our approach to heritage and its conservation itself, where we need to see heritage as a network or a system, or perhaps as heritage capital or heritage environment, touching all aspects of our lives. Our tendency to put heritage into silos of nature, culture, art, tangible, intangible, etc., even on the same site has perhaps done more damage to it than the development pressure itself. This way, this artificial distinction has to a degree also pitted heritage against itself, if we look at it as a composite system. While such differentiations don't even exist in most traditional societies or even in the minds of the users. This realization perhaps also needs to be addressed at the World Heritage level, where we tend to celebrate a few isolated icons while relegating many more to be of lesser importance. Imagine if we were to use the same approach in nature conservation, if we were to select a few best tigers or elephants, or only a very few rare species for protection and conservation. We do apologies to George Orwell. I may, just to be a little bit provocative, have we unwittingly created an animal farm of heritage then? Having said that, heritage is also being used as a protection tool. An example I like to give is from Cambodia in Koke, an otherwise almost a forgotten village in central Cambodia. This 10th century temporal capital of King Jayavarmana IV is intriguing, as the temporary infrastructure created for merely 20 years still survives today and is used by the local communities, especially its hydrological feature, which are well maintained by the resident, as these ponds and water bodies are not only the perennial source of water for them, but it also provides them with food security through agriculture and fisheries, besides the sites giving them other economic benefits through tourism. Another example from India is of Raghurajpur, a traditional artisan village in Orissa, where efforts of the women of the village revived their dying crafts, who otherwise were taboo to practice these arts. This has led to complete transformation of the village and put them on the world tourism map. It is my strong belief that heritage can not only heal or generate wealth, but also give solace. It is perhaps our only hope, even in this darkness, or should I say smogness, while I join you today from New Delhi. Thanking again AusHeritage for this wonderful partnership and opportunity to speak my mind in this forum, and I look forward for further discussion during this webinar. Thanking you again.
Thank you so much, Divay. To our next panelist, Dr. Mathew Trinker, who is the Director of the National Museum of Australia, Chair of ICOM, I should say, and Co-Chair of the Australia-Singapore Arts Group. Under Mathew's leadership, the National Museum has developed strongly engaged national and international programs with partnerships with a range of cultural institutions abroad, including organizations in Singapore, China, Japan, Vietnam, France, Germany, Sweden, and the UK. He has a professional interest in the historical and contemporary links between Australia and Asia. Mathew's topic today is titled The Power of Public Policy, and I think we've seen that play out in a range of places across the world in recent times, perhaps not in the cultural sphere though. Over to you, Mathew.
Thanks, Sharon, and great to be with you all today. I trust that my video is working. Yes, I can see that. Look, I am joining you, as did Alex, from the lands of the Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal, Ngambri people of Canberra, and I'm very grateful for the continuing welcome. In fact, I and everybody at the National Museum enjoy from the First Peoples of this place. And I'm thinking about this subject about cultural policy and its capacity to support the work that we do. I was thinking in a sense, in similar ways to Divay, around the way that we've built a conception of cultural heritage in quite precise terms. And in fact, today I'd like to situate that within the way that I prefer to think about our cultural selves, and that is to think of it as being inclusive of an enormously diverse and complex range of practices that encompass art and cultural activity across a very broad spectrum. So I'm thinking here of course, heritage research, conservation, interpretation, but also collections, the breadth of the GLAM sector, if you like, the sector that I sit within, and arts enterprise across the performing arts, literature, music, design, and beyond. And in a sense, also taking in scholarship and thought leadership across the humanities and the life experiences and traditions of the peoples of the countries in which we live. And in our case, from the First Nations of Australia through to all who have come after and made this place home. And all these things, I think, communicate essential aspects of our shared humanity on this remarkable continent, indeed on this globe. And all these practices in culture animate and enrich our lives. They benefit our society and its health and well-being, and they drive aspects of our economy, the knowledge economy in particular. In this wide sense, cultural heritage is really the full expression of us as a community or a series of communities. It's strengthened by the complex association of all these parts. Now, in recent years, I've been involved with an arts and culture think tank in Australia called A New Approach, funded by the Myer, Keir and Fairfax Foundations. And that's been contributing and in some cases leading public debate about the value of arts and culture in our lives. And among other things, A New Approach has researched and published a series of insight reports that seek to extend our national conversation in this area. And if you haven't seen those things, I'd encourage you to have a look, Google A New Approach and take a look at reports, particularly report number 4 that's entitled Behind the Scenes, Drivers of Arts and Cultural Policy Settings in Australia and Beyond. And it makes a cogent and powerful argument for the development of the nation's cultural policies at all tiers across local, state and federal government. And I just want to take a quote from one of the key recommendations in that report, and it's this: it's acknowledging that we need, or asking that we need greater integration of cultural policy across all the genres of cultural activity that maximise the opportunities. And quoting from the report, it says this: the most effective cultural policies underpinned by economic contribution drivers take a creative industries approach and demonstrate how arts, culture and creative activities interact with each other to increase creativity and innovation across the economy. And I think that means we should be thinking like Divay, more from that focused conception of cultural heritage out towards a broader context, a view that would encourage greater interactivity with other practices and activities right across the creative industries. And so for me in the museum, that means how could I work, for example, more closely with people in performing arts? And it might mean for a heritage conservation architect, how can they tie their work to that of librarians or archivists and others? And it's this argument for a set of cultural policies rather than simply a cultural policy at a federal or a state or a local level that stitches together aspects of cultural policies across all levels of government that I think addresses some of the sense of vacuum that we've felt in terms of the absence of cultural policy, certainly in Australia in recent years. And, you know, I note that the Standing Committee for Communications of the Arts in the Australian Parliament recently made this recommendation for a national cultural plan, with its report Sculpting a National Cultural Plan. And it's this sense in which cultural policy can be constituent within that cultural plan, but it's also about the execution of policy, about how to take that forward. Now, we can continue to argue to governments that we need cultural policy, overarching cultural policy of this kind, but we have to demonstrate why this sense of greater integration across cultural practice is a self-evident truth. It's up to us, I think, not just our political masters, to help show and demonstrate the power that comes from connecting cultural heritage to other aspects of our cultural lives. So if I was going to leave you with one aspect from today's short presentation, it's this: really to search for opportunities within our professional lives to work constructively across our own interests within cultural heritage to the interests of others working in broader fields around culture and human experience. And when we do that, when we make the argument for better integration of the aspects of our cultural lives, then I think we make also the argument for cultural policy that can help us really extend and drive what I believe will be one of the great forces of our societies in the 21st century. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matt. I can already start to see an ecosystem emerging in the panelists' presentations. Our next panelist is Aufa Abd Rahman, who is a practicing architect who's been managing conservation and urban regeneration projects in the Georgetown World Heritage Site in Malaysia. She's been working closely with government, subject experts and stakeholders to execute culture-based initiatives in heritage sites with an innovative approach to implementing projects in historic urban landscape. Aufa's topic today is unlocking cultural identity for local economic development, Over to you, Aufa.
Hi, thanks. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me to this webinar. So hearing from, from Matt and also from Divay on their experience on the sustainable development really inspires me. So moving on to my presentation. So as we all experience this pandemic that has inevitably actually impacted tourism industry globally, and this also include the livelihood that are dependent on the economy surrounding heritage and culture sites. So we all also experience numerous lockdowns and being trapped in our own household that somehow trigger our desire to wander the world and travel to places again. So this notion also urges a renewed need to look at cultural tourism as one of the sectors that revitalizes the growth of prospects, as well as providing source of job creation, as well as enhancing the local economic development. I think on top of that, this also fosters a growing demand from the public themselves, and this also evidently from many reports that they are actually demanding for more authentic and immersive experiences for visitors when visiting cultural sites. So it's no longer like a touch and go kind of experience, but it's more about you want to be more engaged in the cultural activities, interact with the people, and fully utilize all your 5 senses, or 6 if you have one, to experience it to the fullest. So the question is, how do we cater to that need? So this goes back to the notion of place identity or cultural identity. How do we unlock them, the value of that cultural identity that's already embedded into spaces, so that it can generate an ecosystem that support the local economic development. So fundamentally, of course, the local communities need to deeply value their own cultural identity that often expressed, as through architecture, archaeology, language, gastronomy, and shared culture values. So this identity, or as my own director would call it, spirit of place, can be enhanced and potentially be integrated into a network of places that connects one site to another to generate a holistic socio-economic benefits. So this imprint of sense of belonging and strong cultural identity will also help to sustain the provision of an enriching content, spark the excitement of journey of discovery and exchange of cultural knowledge. So on the other hand, the visitors need to also be culturally sensitive and travel responsibly to respect the local identity so that it can be preserved long term. So it should be a two-way approach. And on another spectrum, I believe that the government needs to also see the value of cultural identity and its economy surrounding it as a recovery plan. So they can perhaps empower the local communities through investments into culture-based initiatives, incentive for grants, and involve the communities in the drafting of policy framework since the beginning. So I think it is timely now to piece together all these strategies of using heritage, as Divay mentioned, using heritage as an enabler for a sustainable development, and do it right this time so we can build its own resiliency. So curating and packaging that untapped cultural identity is one step, but to sustain it is another strategy altogether, where I think this can only be achieved through collaboration, of course, between public and private sectors, driven by local communities, essentially led by the government and us heritage practitioners that help to curate that, as Matt said, curate that platform where everybody can meet and become the neutral party to help engage those stakeholders. So it may be slow progress to some, but I believe this is what sustainable is all about. It's a long-term process, and it's not a quick grab and it is wise to do it right, slowly, together, without leaving anyone behind. So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aufa. Our next speaker is Heather Brown. Heather's the Assistant Director at Artlab in Australia. She's based in Adelaide. She also lectures to university students and colleagues on digital and physical preservation management. And her research expertise is in the interconnections between digital and physical preservation of heritage collections. This research has led Heather to the development of disaster management resources for the Australian Library and Information Association that interconnect disaster management of physical and digital collections. Heather's had a long-standing and continuing interest in the experience of preservation in India's physical and digital collections, with a really special focus on the integration of disaster risk management into that practice. And today's talk that Heather will present is called A Story of Collaboration. Over to you, Heather.
Thank you. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I stand on the land of the Kaurna people. To set the scene, I work for an organisation called Artlab Australia, and Artlab's responsible for the conservation of the collections of South Australia's cultural institutions, the art gallery, the library, the museum, the history trust, etc. And Artlab also undertakes commercial work, projects in South Australia, interstate and internationally. So this is a story of collaboration between Australia and India that gives hope in the dark. Next slide. The collaboration is in the field of training in collections disaster management. It involves training Indian colleagues to prevent, prepare, respond and recover from disasters that can damage and destroy India's extraordinarily rich cultural heritage collections. The three organisations are, beginning from the left, Bharatiya Sanskriti Darshan Australia, or BSDA. That's a small Australian association with the aim to promote and sustain Indian cultural heritage. The second organisation on the right is Artlab Australia, and underneath the lamps is the symbol of the Indira Gandhi National Centre for the Arts, IGNCA, which is a peak organisation in India, which has an interdisciplinary approach to the preservation of Indian cultural heritage. So the first spark, the seed funding, came from BSDA, the private organisation. BSDA funded the airfare and accommodation for Dr. Achal Pandya, the head of conservation at IGNCA, to come to Australia for disaster management training. So the lamp was lit in 2018 when Artlab Australia provided 1 week's training in disaster management for Dr. Pandya, and the training included hands-on practical salvage training. Stage 2 of the collaboration was when IGNCA funded 2 Artlab staff members, Anne Deneen, who's the principal or preventive conservator, and myself, and we co-delivered with Dr. Pandya a 5-day training course at IGNCA in August 2019. This workshop was designed as a train the trainer session and was highly interactive, and it involved many practical sessions and scenarios, including developing an integrated disaster plan. So, and if we move to the next slide, what exactly is integrated disaster management? Well, today's collections in cultural institutions are largely hybrid. That is, they contain materials that are both physical and digital. So integrated disaster management is about an holistic approach, an integrated approach to disaster management of physical and digital collections. It's a one-stop shop approach that covers all the collections regardless of their formats. And the participants in the workshop in India were a cross-disciplinary group. They included conservators, students, staff from the National Archives, the National Museum, the Red Cross, and other participants. And the sessions covered stages of preparing, preventing, responding, and recovering disasters that impact on digital and physical collections. Dr. Jha, the head of cultural informatics, delivered a fantastic session on how disaster management is essential to maintaining and sustaining trusted digital repositories. And IGNCA is one of the major organisations in India that has a truly trusted digital repository. So overall, the training was highly successful. There was tremendous feedback, and it demonstrated how training builds knowledge, understanding, skills, and experience. Now, the lamp is still burning. Despite the pandemic, the story continues. Dr. Pandya and I have co-delivered keynote webinars for DELNet, which is India's developing library network, and for IGNCA in 2021. Moreover, during the last 18 months, I've delivered multiple webinars to collecting organisations across India, including the National Library of India and university libraries. And from the feedback, there's clear, consistent evidence of strong, ongoing interest in building a community of practice and skills in effective disaster management with peak organisations like IGNCA and DELNet and the National Archives and the National Library. So this is a continuing story that brings hope in the dark, building knowledge, understanding, skills and resilience in disaster management. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the next chapters will bring. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, all speakers. That was lovely. And I'm so impressed by you sticking to time as well. Thank you. My first question before we leap into the chat is, it's about optimism. What makes you optimistic? Divay, can we kick off with you perhaps?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I mean, it's a thought-provoking question. And I would like to say that, like, you know, if to use the same 3 pillars as criteria, I find that heritage is still remain economically very, very lucrative, high potential for social inclusion, and we are started to discover several environmental benefits of it. I think if those are the parameters of sustainability, I think heritage has a huge chance of being an enabler or our way forward into combating the climate change and other challenges that we face today. That's one. Secondly, I think that, like I'd mentioned in my presentation, the pandemic, thankfully, also have not diminished I think the importance of heritage, because a lot of people thought, like, because it's sort of considered as something non-essential, is going to take a huge hit. And but I think people turn to heritage more and more now for solutions. And I find that also brings a lot of optimism to me, that people have really started to look at their heritage. We were actually afraid that we perhaps would be jobless post-pandemic, because as heritage conservation, we thought nobody will invest in conservation. Everybody will just give money to help. But I'm now surprised at the amount of departments or heritage owners that are really wanting to restore their buildings, like departments we never thought would really come around, like post or even the army or the railways, which are very forward-looking departments, even like the oil rigs. They're all started to really want that something needs to be done to their heritage. Some local solutions need to be found. So I think this is where my optimism stems from.
Thank you. Thank you. Matt, how about you?
Yeah, it is a good question. Thanks, Alex. And like Divay, I think that there's been aspects of what our response to this global pandemic that have given me cause for some optimism. And it's not to understate just how much of a calamity this has been to all of us around the world. But sometimes in the moment, in these sort of exigent moments, you get people responding from the sort of the well springs of, you know, the best parts of the self, and from really what makes us human, and from which we can draw some correspondences with the experiences of others. And I think that there's been enough that I've seen about people asking themselves fundamental questions about what matters to them, about, you know, who they are. And those questions so often tie us into the, you know, the work that we do in certainly in cultural heritage, but more broadly in that kind of arts and cultural frame in which I was describing things in my presentation. And so I feel encouraged by that. And I suppose I feel encouraged because in the midst of that, I've seen that kind of movement to a more integrative spirit in cultural practice, where people are looking to say, look, yeah, I work in a museum, but how can I strike across to work with people who might be working in place heritage or beyond, to performing arts? And thinking even about the work some of you would know that we did with the Gregorian brothers, musicians, earlier this year, asking them to respond to some aspects of our collection. I felt a great sense of affirmation in that work, and also the fact that it seemed to resonate with other people. So that gives me cause for optimism.
Lovely, thank you. And Aufa, what makes you optimistic?
Yeah, I guess it can be disheartening right at this time. It feels like we are starting all over again. But I guess compared to all these, you know, brilliant speakers from this webinar, I feel like I still have a long way to go. But personally, I think that if there's to me, the fact that there is a strong support system available now, like we have now the network of organization with common interests that exist today to promote, you know, the relevance of heritage and culture in sustainable development, I will probably stay optimistic. And if there's a good strategic recovery plan available, and there is a succession plan put in place, and I think most importantly, good leadership. If all the others, the rest fail, I think we'll need to start from us, from you. You become the leader, and in order for the rest to follow suit, of course.
Thank you. And finally, Heather, what makes you optimistic?
I
did give a lovely example of that joint work. But
yes, I think it's picking up on what Mathew said, and also I guess my connections with India. It's that wellspring in the human heart. And one of the great Indian philosophers, Swami Vivekananda, has a beautiful quote about optimism, and it's about that we should all cultivate this optimistic temperament and endeavour to see the good in everything. Because if we sit down and lament about what's going wrong and, you know, woe is us, his words are, we profit nothing. But if we go on and go ahead, and he calls it our heroic endeavours, if we go ahead and jump the hurdles, then that carries our spirit forward. So that's a kind of philosophical take on it, but it very much underpins and encourages me to move forward.
Thank you. The next question is one about youth engagement, which Aufa, you brought up when we were having a chat the other day. How do we engage our young people? How do we support them, nurture them, engage them?
Right. Well, I think what society tends to forget is how powerful children's minds can be. You know, they're like sponge, right? Just ready to absorb all the knowledge and information. And with that in mind, I think this will give us an opportunity to instill interest on heritage and culture and educate, you know, the role of these two critical subjects in shaping the city in our future. To me, it is essential, of course, to engage with them early, speak their language, use their terminologies, so they can actually continue the effort. I think, in fact, they can actually become our valuable ambassador that can also influence their peers to, you know, help to continue to embark this journey of cultural preservation and celebration. Yeah.
Thank you. And Matt, how do you and the museum and the cultural community here in Australia tackle this one?
Yeah, well, this is the what is it, the $64 million question, isn't it? How do you get the kind of attachment and engagement that you need to see generational change, I think, right across all areas of sort of heritage and cultural practice. And I don't pretend I've got an easy answer for it, but I do think, yeah, sorry, certainly not in the space of just this webinar. It's a long conversation. It's a webinar on its own, isn't it, really? But I do think there's something really important about, you know, inverting this whole idea of the more conventional pipe of producers and consumers in cultural practice. And you have to be prepared to say, no, we're all participating in a more dialogic way as we discuss what it means to be human and how we understand our cultural lives. And that means asking young people what their sense of themselves is and what's important to them, and get them to express that in an ongoing conversation, rather than think that we've got stuff that they should be consuming as consumers of cultural heritage in a way, in a very conventional sense. And you got to do that digitally, obviously, because, you know, even a Luddite like me has realised with the 14-year-old and the 12-year-old in my household that it's pointless talking to them if they're looking at a screen. So you need to be able to engage, I think, in the terms by which young people are having conversations about these things, and you need to not tell them, but ask them what's important to them and get them involved in conversation about things. And I don't think it's easy.
I think respect is such a common theme, I think, throughout, in terms of how we all work together. Yeah, you were having some ideas about this. Can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm saying I completely agree with Matt and Alpha on this one. And in fact, you know, somehow, I mean, in our country, heritage is very, very formal. And we generally tend to use like books and mediums that were actually not even reaching to the youth. And there's some bit of reluctance of putting like a few seconds of videos in about heritage, because a lot of people thought it's trivializing. But, you know, considering the youth today apparently has a attention span of less than about 8 seconds, you have to get across your point like in those 8 seconds with a bang. Another thing we've really seen, I mean, they're very sharp, and I think the youth today, unlike perhaps our generation, are not so much swayed by emotions. You know, they generally tend to take decisions based on hard facts. And that's why I think if you know, in my experience, they are far more sensitive and appreciative of the natural heritage causes, because, you know, we are able to give them, okay, 1 tree cut is so much oxygen less, and 1 species less is so much climate change, and 2 degrees. But unfortunately, those sort of hard facts, scientific things, have not really permeated within the cultural sector. We're still talking about emotions and identity, and, you know, so which I think the youth has very little space for in their lives, because, you know, they don't really see themselves as rooted as we used to see, like global citizens. So I think to catch their attention, we need to really re-look at our strategy. Now, one of the things that we've done, which Matt also was mentioning, and also after not much success in that, by organizing so-called awareness campaigns on giving them these capsules on heritage, we're now asking them, what is heritage for you? What is that you want to preserve? What would you like to preserve? What do you see as heritage? Now that has been very, very successful, because the youth here today is also sort of in a leadership position. They want to be in control of several things. So instead of we telling what they need, it has to come out of them. So I think our crowdsourcing of heritage listing, our programs on them telling us has been hugely successful. That overbooked, while we used to be, earlier programs used to really sort of scramble for participation.
Thank you. And Heather, you have some thoughts on this?
I love this topic. There's a phrase called "catch them when they're young," and I have been part, because I used to be a children's librarian in the past, so that kind of equips me. But in the past, I've been involved in working at the State Library of South Australia and with Artlab Australia in working to promote cultural heritage, but integrating it with the school curriculum. So what we did was actually get the science teachers in, and we worked with them to integrate the preservation of cultural heritage into the science curriculum. So it was actually part of what the students had to study. And then at that stage, we didn't have digital materials, but we had the students coming into the State Library and doing experiments that were very simple. And the leading students would then report back to the other students and engage them. We also had the really tiny ones coming into the library. We had them bringing in some treasures and creating treasure chests to preserve their heritage, and then sort of inductive learning, I suppose, is the way of learning. So they're starting from what they know and then building that understanding of heritage. So the staff who delivered that said to me that was one of the best experiences we've had, because we had to capture the essence of what we do and make it understandable. And if you can make it understandable to young ones, you can actually, it actually generated a whole lot of enthusiasm for the people working in that area. So it wasn't just teaching others, it was actually reinvigorating the staff as well. But a key is integrating it into curriculum, which you can do at primary, secondary, and also in the tertiary courses. I think that's a good synergy. Enough.
Sharon.
Thanks, Alex. We've had a couple of questions come into the chat box, which I'll put to the panel, and I'll just combine them if the questioner doesn't mind. It's really around the value of heritage and the economics of heritage. I think we've touched on that nerve. It's often very difficult to sort of compel the market to see the value that people like us perhaps see in heritage and culture, when it's difficult to put a price on it. And one of the questions is that it's a really significant obstacle in this space. And how do you think we might better or more accurately put a value on heritage and culture and make a more compelling business case, I suppose, for it? Who wants to tackle that first off? Perhaps there's some clues, Matt, in the work that you mentioned, the new approaches.
Look, I think, that's a complex question, because at one level, I think a lot of us feel that when you sort of over-instrumentalise a discussion about economic value, you start to lose some of the other great strength of purpose that we gain from an aim that says that arts and culture ennoble our lives. It's intrinsic values, a whole range of social benefits, as well as sort of a kind of an economic value or a contribution that makes to economy. I think we have to try and be honest to the fact that we are key players in our national economies when we are doing this work in general. And I think, again, not arguing it solely from a position of just saying, well, in cultural heritage, in heritage practice around place heritage and built heritage, this is worth X. I think we're better saying, look, we are a key component of something called the arts and cultural life of nation, and we have to make that argument more effectively about the economic value of that. And, you know, you think about other jurisdictions where this seems to be more innately felt and held. And I think about in the United Kingdom, where some good work has happened in this space. And the white paper, you know, from 2016, it feels to me as if we have to be more assertive in a wider sense of saying, this isn't just nice to have on the weekend. This is business Monday to Friday. We have to have that conversation with the political masters without devaluing the fact that intrinsic value is not diminished. The things that we love, that kind of sense of humanness is not diminished just because we're going to be honest about economic value. But being simple about it and coming up with a metric in every particular practice within culture is not easy. And I think that the argument has to be made more broadly speaking. We have to have the success at the cultural policy level in that broad aspect. And then it follows, doesn't it, that must be true then of the constituent parts of what we might describe as our cultural sphere. That's the best I've got.
Oh, well, that's pretty good. It's a good start, I think. Aufa, you mentioned cultural tourism. Perhaps there's something in that you might want to pick up.
Well, I mean, echoing to what Matt was saying, we actually also had, difficulties of convincing the policymakers and also the decision makers essentially and it's very hard to put value on culture and heritage. So from our experience, what we usually use the previous cases of other areas to convince them that if this can be successfully happened elsewhere, probably some of the frameworks can be applied, in our nation. And this is probably the only way to make them visualize of, the possibilities, the potential of investing into cultural economy. I think basically that's how we did it. And it's still a very challenging, step of convincing them. But essentially, that's the first step, at least, to help them visualize.
Thanks so much, Aufa. And Divay, perhaps you might want to contribute too. Oh, you're on mute.
This is exactly the problem I was really trying to raise, that, why do we really need to be in a position we need to really convince? I mean, why are we in this position in the first place? Do you think if I was in an education sector, I would have to do that? Do you think if I was in the health sector, I would have to do that? It's precisely because culture is not seen as an integral part of development. So I want to be in a position where culture is integrated within a system where I don't have to convince anyone. It is seen as like any other investment I am doing in housing or in social housing or education or health or any other sector, for recreation or so many things like creating open parks. I mean, I don't know what, I think it's only the heritage sector people who need to sort of give this balance sheet on what is your investment and what is your output. And like Mathew said, that somehow we've also sort of fallen into the trap on being able to use the same economics as we use for new built or new aspects for heritage. I think the models that have been developed in the economic world are not really essentially geared towards, justifying heritage. We have to really look at several other sectors. Having said that, I feel that that's also could be an apologetic way of not putting heritage on the center stage. If we are to cater to the market forces, we may need to really put a value, and the way that we do value is, I think somebody also commented about just about labor force. But what about the carbon emission we are saving? We are definitely, there is a carbon value to our heritage. What are the values that we are saving because this building has designed in passive ways, the air conditioning, the heating, which is generally less than. So I think these are the values we need to really start putting into heritage. And I feel it's inherently far more economical if we start putting all these values together.
Thank you. Thank you. We've only got a few minutes left, and I have a question about where would you put your biggest focus? What are your priorities? What's the most productive space now for cultural heritage and for the sort of work that you and all our audience and participants are working in? You've got about 30 seconds each, I'd say, to actually tell me. Who wants to kick off? Heather.
So, of course, disaster management, because the work that you can do can unravel in a single disaster. And to build on that previous comment, disaster management, the preservation, sustaining of that heritage actually builds community resilience after a disaster. So that's a really good argument. Okay, next.
Yep, I'll fund you.
I actually kind of like on the same page with Heather on the disaster risk management, because it takes like millennials, thousands of years to build our own heritage, but it takes a second to destroy it. So I think we'll need to be, careful of our development progress. And I guess the new disaster risk, of course, the risk assessment is essential. Yeah, now.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you. Matt?
Oh, look, I think, given what I've said earlier, it's all about linkages for me. I'm trying to think about how it's not just a museum, it's actually a kind of a cultural resource centre when I think about the National Museum. And that sounds a bit glib, but I think this century and our success in this century preserving, holding on to the things that matter for us as human beings is going to be about seeing the correspondences across those silos that Divay's talked about, these sort of artificial divides. This is about who we are. And the more we can show that investment in the museum is also an investment in our cultural lives in terms of our performing arts or something else, how they nourish each other, then I think we've got more of a chance of convincing publics and legal masters of our value.
Thank you. And Divay?
Well, I like to put my money on building at least 2 bridges with heritage, one with economics, the other one with environment. And I think that purely would integrate heritage within, put it on the center stage that we would like it to be.
Yeah, and as you said at the beginning, really saying with the Sustainable Development Goals, they're absolutely critical, and heritage is a key part of so many of them.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely, and really, really pushing that very strongly. Look, thank you so much. I'll hand now back to Sharon for the final good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much to each and every one of our speakers today for their very powerful and thoughtful insights into some of the currents in today's thinking and experience of culture and heritage. It seems we're trying to have a bigger conversation, but at the same time, a more nuanced and sophisticated conversation. And it's that ecosystem of hearts and minds through culture that we're trying to connect with across not only our geopolitical spaces, but a range of other areas of activity. So we're delighted to have you here today and your enthusiastic engagement, and thank you for your preparation and time in being here. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Alex Marsden, who has done the lion's share in organising today's webinar, alongside the indefatigable Penny Tripp, with technical support from the University of Melbourne, and Tim Auld. Thank you so much. Finally, I'd like to encourage all of you, if you're not already, to consider joining AusHeritage. We've got an exciting new strategic plan which provides a range of opportunities, and our membership connects you with an international network of heritage and people engaged in that space to have these continuing conversations, such as the one that we've all learnt from today. And you can visit the website at ausheritage.org.au. And can I please remind AusHeritage members in the audience today to attend from 4 p.m. our members only forum, which you would have received an email link to. And the members only forum will be followed by our AGM at 4:30. Thank you to each and every one of you in our audience for coming along today. Hope you leave with a sense of hope and optimism in the future of culture and heritage as we emerge from these challenging times. Enjoy your weekend wherever you may be. Thank you.